A top story this hour, the Russian embassy vehemently denies media reports that Vladimir Putin had a hand in President Jacob Zuma's recent cabinet reshuffle. In a statement, the Russian embassy says the article is yet another example of sensationalism and fake news in the South African press. Referring to a Sunday Times article titled "From Russia with Love," the embassy says the slanderous piece is based entirely on hearsay and unnamed sources. The article says a top-level Russian team allegedly acting on direct orders from Russian President Vladimir Putin met President Jacob Zuma shortly before the surprise cabinet reshuffle this week. It further says David Mahlobo was chosen by the Russians to be energy minister to conclude a multi-billion-dollar nuclear deal with the Russians. The Russian embassy denies there was any high-level Russian delegation in the country last week. They accused the Sunday Times of using tabloid-grade methods in their desperate bid for publicity.
We are not aware of any high-level Russian delegation visiting South Africa in the last couple of weeks. There was no delegation, and nobody actually contacted us to verify, to do, the basic groundwork, which is the 101 journalism, for us to give a comment or to clarify whether there is actually any delegation in South Africa. So we are very disappointed by this approach taken by Sunday Times and other media outlets reporting on this news. We consider this not up to the high-quality journalism standards. Well, I think the official comment that you can find on the embassy's website or on social media is enough for the time being. It is very easy to get entangled in legal action, etc., etc. It's not really within the capabilities of the embassy, so to speak. But we'll see how the events transpire. But the things that the Sunday Times trying to imprint on the minds of the South African audience with regard to Russia, to use Russia as a scarecrow, so to speak, that's definitely not true. It is not based on any facts. It is based on anonymous sources, as it usually is. It is very hard to fight, ghosts.
Now let's take a look at the claims made in the article and the rebuttal from the Russian embassy. Firstly, the Sunday Times says Russian President Vladimir Putin had a hand in the cabinet reshuffle, on which the Russian embassy says that notion that Russia could be interfering in South Africa's domestic affairs is plain ridiculous. The article claims that top-level Russian team met President Jacob Zuma shortly before the cabinet reshuffle, on which the Russian government says they are unaware of any high-level delegation coming to South Africa from Russia last week. And Sunday Times goes on to claim that David Mahlobo's appointment was ordered by the Russians to speed up the nuclear deal with the Russians, and the Russians rubbishing the claim, and the embassy says any such interference goes contrary to Russia's foreign policy. Of course, it's been a very sensational story, hot on everyone's lips, and we cut across now to my colleague Audrey Chimwanda for more. Thanks so much for joining us, and good evening to you. Of course, we've seen the rebuttals and counter-arguments. What more do you have for us?
Oh, absolutely, Cindy. Quite a sensationalized story, and we're here to give our viewers the facts so that they can suss out for themselves the narrative that has been in the mainstream media. Now, taking a look at fact number one, the nuclear deal, the nuclear energy is part of South Africa's energy policy. It is not a clandestine bid by President Jacob Zuma. It raises the question why the media is painting it as an illegal nuclear deal with Russia. Taking a look at fact number two, inking of a nuclear deal requires a fresh bidding process. It requires public participation. It also requires parliament approval. It raises the question once again, why would President Zuma go through an elaborate cabinet reshuffle just to appoint Mahlobo, who is constrained as it is already by a court ruling? Taking a look at fact number three, setting up a nuclear power plant is most profitable for a few nations that are already marketing this technology. For example, we have the United States. Raising the question once again, is the media frenzy over a possible nuclear deal with Russia pushed by the United States, possibly so that they could land the project deal themselves instead? Well, we don't know. All we can do is give you the facts. And fact number four says South Africa's BRICS membership is a thorn in the sides of the United States and is allies raises the question once again, is there fear by vested interests that if President Zuma's administration could possibly be slipping out of the United States grip? I'll leave it up for you to make your decision. Over to you, Cindy.
All right, and also getting more clarity, thanks so much, Audrey. We're joined by political analyst Tsepo Khadima. Good evening to you, Tsepo, and thanks for your time. Of course, it's been making news headlines, and murmurings have permeated throughout the media space for months that this is ultimately what the sinister plan was of Jacob Zuma in reshuffling the cabinet in order to get his wish around the lucrative nuclear deal. Your view?
Look, I would like to, maybe the viewers, to read the article in the Sunday Times in context of what Vladimir Lenin once said, and I quote him. He said, all over the world, wherever there are capitalists, freedom of the press means freedom to buy up newspapers, to buy writers, to bribe, buy and fake public opinion for the benefit of the bourgeoisie. And I can speak from experience as far as the Times Media Group is concerned, who are the publishers of Sunday Times, that indeed that which Benjamin Franklin once said was the case is indeed applicable to the Times Media Group, that the only truth in their newspapers is nothing but the advertisements. Because when you read that story, there can be no shred of any evidence that exists in that story to suggest that indeed what they wrote can be the case. But if anything is disrespectful in the extreme, in the person of President Zuma, and more so, even allegation, a grave allegation, that President Zuma has seriously broken his oath of office as enshrined in the Constitution, that in fact he's not acting as he should in terms of the executive powers conferred upon him by the Constitution, but that is acting at the behest of outside parties. And that is the most dangerous thing, that a newspaper such as this one could be peddling and be allowed to continue to the extent that it can affect very seriously our relations with other nations, and in this case, the Republic of Russia.
All right, but Tsepo, is it possible or plausible that the media in itself are merely reporting on what their sources tell them? And we know that sources may have their own hidden agendas, that it may not necessarily be up to the editor or the reporter themselves. It really emanates from the source of where the story comes from, that we're sitting with this sort of conspiracy theory and suspicion around why South Africa is with BRICS and why the Russians are in town.
Well, certainly Russia, I think it's a very large nation. We have got a bilateral relations with Russia as we do with other nations, and also in a multilateral setting, either in the G20 or in the BRICS nations, we are there with Russia. There can be nothing untoward if there are any meetings between Russian officials as well as South African officials in any case, because these are countries that have got cordial, friendly relationships, as we do with the United States of America, by the way. We have to bear in mind that there are many American companies that operate from here. However, what is worrying is that our newspapers have allowed themselves, and the owners have allowed themselves to confirm the long-held allegation that every story published in their newspapers is paid for. And clearly that story, as appeared, could only be a story that had been paid for by somebody who wanted to achieve a sinister end by perhaps straining the relations between us and the Russians, or by creating a ruse in order to bring about another event. It could be of the regime change nature, or that of creating by innuendo and conjecture that the president in this case is incapable. But for whatever reason that it is despicable in the extreme and has to be condemned. Our newspapers have to act responsibly. That is what is required of them. And I think even the former president of the United States, John F. Kennedy, lamented this in terms of what is required of the press. And they are acting responsibly in South Africa. So, after all, the African National Congress is the one that is to blame for this morass we find ourselves in, because had they taken necessary steps, we would not have been finding ourselves to be in this in terms of regulating, because we know that the Press Council and the Press Ombudsman, they are nothing but toothless dogs. Hence, we can have Times media newspapers in the main being unrepentant repeat offenders, because they know that nothing will come out of it.
And of course, there is also vested interest. You've lamented the fact about the independent power producers vis-a-vis the nuclear supporters, if you will, that ultimately it is about who shares the bigger share or the part of the cake when it comes to our energy mix.
Yes, indeed. But I think it goes even beyond just the issue of our power system in South Africa, where currently private profiteers are ensuring that they can achieve their greedy, profiteering ends by bringing onto this energy system the type of energy that we cannot afford whatsoever, and have created a scarecrow. But what is amazing is that when one American company, Westinghouse, was in the running in the year 2011-2012 to build the nuclear power for South Africa, there was no hurrah whatsoever. It's only once they were no longer in the running that now, of course, Russia has become the boogeyman of nuclear, despite the fact that it has long been included in our energy system. And in fact, the National Development Plan does make provision for nuclear. However, we also have to see this in context, that there is also a Cold War continuing between the United States and Russia, and we just happen to, of course, be the convenient scapegoat in that war that is being waged against Russia, and more so in terms of our relations. So if anything, the situation is a lot more serious than what it is. And what is astonishing is that at some point in time, the United States government, and specifically the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, at some point in time, they are going to have to issue some sort of a statement, because right now the allegations are growing louder and louder that they have a hand to play in this unfortunate situation we find ourselves in as a country. And they're going to have to clarify that if they care about the relations between South Africa and the United States.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Tshepo Kgadima is always much appreciated for your insight and analysis. Political analyst Tshepo Kgadima reacting to the Russian embassy's statement, saying that the Sunday Times, the article is slanderous and misleading with regards to the high-level delegation that was purported to have influenced the hand of President Jacob Zuma in the recent cabinet reshuffle.